It's My Round is a brief and entirely sober but somewhat irreverent journey into the world of taverns and alehouses, pubs and inns, hostelries, hotels, and their suppliers, with me, Bill Sadler, your virtual host for this presentation. It is a virtual heritage round of brewers, distillers, and purveyors of fine drink in and around Grantown. Yet in the spirit of a virtual tour, we can journey backwards and forwards through time, visiting people and places, both in the 21st century and in days long past. Fill up your glasses, make yourselves comfortable, and come with me. We'll start the journey in 1755 in the Bollyward Inn, providing one of my favourite views. Situated at the top of Bollyward Brae, it would have been a stopping point for travellers and a place for meetings. Close to Old Grantown, the inn was built on the instructions of Sir Ludovic Grant, for which he paid £100 to Andrew Frew, the master mason supervising the main extension of Castle Grant at the time. The builder lamented the fact that it cost more than £100 and he was out of pocket. So often the way with drink-related adventures. It was for many years the main inn in Mid Strathspey, even after the foundation of the new town. The courts would also have been held here. There's an interesting court case recorded some 50 years earlier when 3 women were condemned to be tied to the regality cross, made bare from the belt upwards and scourged, each receiving 30 stripes, and then banished from the country. Their crime was conveying drink to prisoners in ward at Castle Grant, who drank to such excess that they died. In the same year, the 4 bailies of Strathspey ordained that only local malt could be used in the brewing of aquavita, which should be sold at a reasonable rate and of sufficient stuff. But maybe we could meet Sir Ludovic, as the Bollyward Inn was close to Castle Grant. Ludovic could manage to tuck away a considerable quantity of alcohol. Hence, the founder of New Grantown, his son, James Grant of Grant, had an aversion to whisky, the consumption of which he tried hard to limit, the pernicious custom of drinking spirits then all too prevalent in the Highlands. The very first inn in Grantown was to have been at the corner of the square, where the Bank of Scotland building is now situated. The first innkeepers in 1765, Janet and John Mackenzie, chose, however, a site in what is now Castle Road. Ironically, the building then became a schoolhouse from which the master did a moonlight flitting, having run up too many debts. Later, it was knocked down to be replaced by a police station. The legendary Janet was a distant relative of the laird. She was a character in her own right and described as being like a balloon without the aid of gas or crinoline. Hers is a remarkable story for another day. She remained in Castle Road less than 2 years before moving to the south side of the square. It wasn't long, however, before there were so many comments about her disorderly conduct within her house in Grantown that she moved off to set up an inn, firstly in Camdell Moor, then Tomintoul. At much the same time, the laird's clerk had a house built at the corner, close to the East End burn. This much later became the Garth Hotel, but in the meantime it housed local doctors, the minister, and many summer guests, including Mary Corelli, who was Queen Victoria's favourite author. Whilst here, we might just take a nip down to the Dunvegan Hotel, purpose-built as a hotel in the 1930s by D.D. Smith the plumber. It was said to be the only new purpose-built hotel ever in Grantown. It became a hospital for troops returning after Dunkirk, and it then lay vacant for quite some time until sold to Raup. It was later described as ideally situated overlooking the sporting 18-hole golf course and also the tennis courts, bowling and putting greens. In the 1960s, as well as such luxuries as central heating and a television lounge, it promised skiing from Christmas to Easter. It's now totally refurbished as the Spey, a 4-star bed and breakfast where the guest lounge is ideal for having a drink whilst mingling by the fire or relaxing and having a quiet read or chat. And then on to the golf clubhouse, dating back to 1890 for perhaps a practice round and another splendid view from the terrace overlooking the woods and the Cromdale Hills. It was the venue for the one-off Grantown Hickory Club Challenge in 2015, and on occasions skiing, but not from Christmas to Easter. I recall one Christmas day rounds in a much warmer climate with limited range of clubs. Had to be room for the beer. Back to the square and the legendary Waterford Hotel, now apartments. It was built as a house on the site of Janet Mackenzie's raucous establishment. Many will remember those Saturday nights in the Waterford where the young folk gathered for a night of music and dance. Dinner dances were famous, and it's perhaps the only hotel for miles around, if anywhere, where the price was negotiated inversely. Jimmy called there, "Oh, we could do that for £3 per head." "That's ridiculous. It should be more like 6. We could make it 4. "That's very generous. How about a £5 a head?" And so it was. James Grant of Grant, as was said earlier, was not in favour of strong liquor. Hence, he encouraged the establishment of brewing, baking, and butcher meat co-partnery to be set up in what became the Grant Arms Hotel. Frequently, he tried to call time on excessive sales of whisky and unlicensed brewing. The new business was to have a monopoly on the making of ale for consumption at the fairs, for workmen out of doors, and for supply to the inns. The tenementers, when signing their leases, agreed that neither they nor their heirs would brew or sell ale or liquor without special permission. In 1784, for example, 45 householders were found to be breaking the lease agreements, and these included his own piper, the postmaster, the schoolmaster, the baker, grocer, and several others. 2 were charged and heavily fined to such an extent that they had to sell their businesses. And in his own establishment, the brewery, the cellars were not confined to vats of nappy ale, but casks of genuine Glenlivet and Strathan Zushkabe. It was the view of Congress's nephew, W.G. Stewart, in 1860, that the native brew of the good Sir James' time was a beverage surpassing in strength, pleasant flavour and taste, the produce of modern breweries. Grantown's foremost hotel, the prestigious 4-star Grant Arms, was the subject of a Grantown Society costume drama, which starred Edwin Burt, the Reverend James Hall and John Grant, Robert Burns, Robert Southey, Thomas Telford, Police Constable James Fraser, who was murdered on stage, and Queen Victoria, to say nothing of a string of owners, managers, bar staff, and other hotel workers. It was Robert Southey who described the owners as foolish people who had wasted their money on expensive furniture, the house not being better than a village alehouse and run by a vulgar woman from Portsmouth. But we think little of his judgment, as he described Grantown as being duller than Rothes. Stepping out of the hotel into Grantown Square, where drinking in public was banned, maybe we should gloss over the New Year shinty matches which took place there, or the feeing markets with public houses and a tent selling beer and whiskey. When the market was over, it was recalled some years later, many could be seen staggering along the streets, completely under the influence. Maybe we should remember Robert Burns' advice about taking heed whene'er to drink you are inclined, or Cutty Sark's run in your mind. In which case, there was at one stage a temperance hotel in the vicinity of what's now the Legion. Temperance worker, paying a surprise visit to the house of his pet convert. "Does Mr. McMurdoch live here?" "Mrs. McMurdoch? Aye, carry him in." We could, of course, drop into the Legion at a time, or at least a year, to suit your mode of dress. Through time, there's been no shortage of licensed grocers. In 1860, you could choose from grocers and wine and spirit merchants, Cumming and MacDougall, John Gordon, or Isabella MacDonald, and now from the two co-ops today, or previously J. Cameron Grant, Catanachs, and the Spar. The Spar, where one year in the store not so long ago, it was so cold that the sound of popping corks was none other than frozen bottles exploding. Across the road is the Rose Hall, originally two houses with an outside stair at the rear. As a hotel, there'd be a warm welcome, some may recall, from Viv McLennan, and at one time even had a nightclub. Now it provides a base for parklands and care of a different kind. Perhaps we could drop into the building just along the square from the Rose Hall, the Mason's Lodge and the gallery, though scant the dram you would have got there at the time, besides the business of another McLennan, a clothier, were the offices of the parish council. How many of you, however, have failed to notice the evidence of a previous business still on the wall? Once we could have dropped in the Mackay's Hotel, a popular destination in the square. And so to Seafield Avenue in 1894 and past the Manse, now Ravenscourt, where in 1965 a room and breakfast for two would have set you back £2, morning tea 2 shillings, and on to number 1, the road from Grantown to Dreggy, built for George Anderson, ironmonger, the square, Grantown. Gordon Hall, as it was named, was let as soon as it was completed and had, according to that year's letting lists, 3 public 9 bedrooms, kitchen, 2 servants' bedrooms with 4 beds, servants' hall, large kitchen, butler's pantry and scullery, large wine cellar. That made you sit up, pay attention. Bathroom, 2 linen closets, storeroom, meat safe, wash house, 3 WCs. The wash house, pantries and sculleries have hot and cold water tubs. There are tennis and croquet greens, etc., etc. However, all this was not enough for one American millionaire, and the West Wing was added with another 3 public and 13 bedrooms. And yes, you recognise it as the Spey Valley Hotel. Secret of good whisky is good water, and of that Grantown has a plentiful supply, notably that copious and pure spring which fed Grantown's first piped water supply. Somewhere in Dulig, not far from this little bridge over the road to Gorton, was thus Grantown's distillery. The evidence for this comes from early 19th century letters. John Fraser's Cullen House Letter Book, 1823-26, makes reference to a distillery at Grantown. On the 18th of June, 1836, Captain John Grant, Congress, wrote to John Fraser about the distillery under construction at the Dulig. And on the 24th of June that year, A. Faulkner wrote to John Fraser about a distillery near Grantown, the building being nearly completed. There's no evidence, however, that it ever came into production. Of the water, however, a few lines of doggerel published in the Strathspey News in December 1929 includes the lines, "The mineral water is sweet as honey. You can take a drink and it costs no money." Back to the High Street and the Grand View, formerly a long-established hotel. As with any such hotel, there are many stories. The following was told at a society presentation entitled Close Encounters. There was a close situated where the front door is now. The building on the right was the old Palace Hotel, or the Black Bull, and on the left, the painters and photographers, Castle Urquhart, later the shop of Beal and Piper. The close led to the stables and byres and the pigsties. There is a story told by Annie Grant in a school magazine of more than 50 years ago, referring to these palatial buildings. One day a week, she wrote, we had sewing from 3 to 4 o'clock, and a few of the braves thought it would be a great adventure to slip sewing. Passing the outer door, we made a dash for the dyke, and on hands and knees crept out the gate. To go home was impossible. The wrath and horror of parents could not be faced, so this precious and stolen hour was spent most enjoyably by the pigsty in the Palace Hotel yard. But the aftermath I leave you to guess. It was from this yard that one day one of the hotel cows, looking for a change of scene, walked unnoticed through a side door of the hotel. She looked at the bar, decided she didn't like it, and took up residence in the front hall. Not until she had well and truly left her trademarks on the floor could Mr. Hastelow and his staff persuade her to go. Making a more dignified exit from the yard would be the palace horse bus, running to and from the station. Mail was carried as well as passengers. The fare was sixpence. The driver sat high on top of the bus, and there are many tales to tell of these men. But again, that must wait for another time. Talking of dignified exits, of course, they come in all manner of ways. Leaving the palace yard and gardens, we could have come to Woodside Avenue. Now, in 1898, and Grantown's become a borough, not a regality, but a police borough. Will that make any difference to our drinking customs? Well, here we are at the Seafield Lodge, and we can ask the provost himself, Andrew Macpherson Grant. He certainly had to preside over many storming meetings of the new council. But let's the Craig. Craigraiveach, originally Laburnum, a single-storey cottage dated 1868, but sold a year later in a public rout for £167. Time perhaps for a pie and a pint, contesting the top spot in today's TripAdvisor as Grantown's foremost attraction, before heading back to the high street. Again, through the ages, names of wine merchants and licensed grocers would have been familiar. The restaurant, now the Wee Puffin, was Victoria Wines, previously Alex Monroe, and once J. Grant, wine merchant, then David Strachan's. One of their original account books tells that on August 29th, 1941, 9 shillings was paid for a half-bottle whisky and 8 shillings for a dozen bottles of beer. Ah, what secrets these books have to tell, and what stories are still to be shared. Only a couple of weeks ago, we heard of Rebecca Addison's dad, who recalls happy childhood memories of Grantown and how he used to deliver groceries for Strachan's to the big houses. Such stories as this are our history and heritage and need to be recorded and kept. And so, once more, Grantown has its own brewery. And what a special display they made at Christmas. Roll on, opening time. Because this is a special virtual round of establishments, old and new, we could arrive at our next venue in style. Not the Benmore, but Grant's Temperance Hotel, disputing the Dunvegan's claim to be the only purpose-built hotel in the town. So, yet again, every step another story, and sometimes quite a surprising one. Every stop another tune, from Alfie's karaoke to a festival music session. On the corner of the High Street and Spey Avenue, Dunbar's Hotel, one of Grantown's oldest, another lost treasure for the drinking public as they stand, obviously waiting for the not yet installed traffic lights to change. Let's take a step now to number 1 North Street East, to the Cop, not to replay some of Liverpool's famous victories, nor the British Empire's fatal defeat near Ladysmith in South Africa. We shall go to what was known as Spion-Coop, the Coppice, now again under a new name and new management. Whilst there are far too many stories to tell for just one round of drinks, we do find that many share the same key characters. The Coppice started life under a very different name, Spion-Coop. Plans were passed in February 1899 for a house on this site, and it was in the name of Jane Grant, none other than the daughter of Alexander Grant of Galloway and the wife of Andrew Macpherson Grant, the first provost. In its earliest days, it was advertised to let for the season, situated within its own grounds of an acre and a half, with a nice open view and conveniently situated near the town and the station. In later years, it was the pub I first visited in Grantown whilst moving into Killintraw Crescent, and where I was first introduced to Grantown's music scene. I confess the ceiling paper I'd been struggling with in my new family home went up a treat when I returned home after midnight. Another hotel, which has recently changed hands, was originally 3 separate villas, number 2, 3 and 4 Station Road. The first of which was Westwood on the corner, built for Mrs. Jessie Sim in 1891, with a stipulation that it was to cost more than £1,000 and be completed within 12 months. It was Mrs. Mackay who bought first the Villa Craig Lynn and later the adjacent villas, and also Bray Murray. The fields in front and behind were used as farmland with hayfields, cows, hens, turkeys and pigs, and behind were used as farmlands with with hayfields, etc. The architectural feat of Harry Fraser in joining Craig Lynn with Enfield is notable, unlike the later link with Westwood, though the major fire of 1962 had an effect on that. Many will remember the hall to the rear of the building, popular for social and sporting events. The Craig Lynn was the starting point for the Society's first dramatic pub crawl in 2007. The original version of the walk itself was on a Sunday afternoon and written as a fundraising event as part of the Macmillan Mile project. 2007 version offered drinks all round, and in the Craig Lynn we told tales of the war through the eyes of the staff and sang choruses of wartime favourites such as It's a Long Way to Tipperary, Bless 'Em All and Roll Out the Barrel. During one of the festivals, we had a Prince and Pauper lunch based on 18th century Castle Grant menus. And at one stage, though I can't find the photo, we even had an illicit still tableau in the front lounge based on a half hot water tank and heating coil. Instead, this tableau comes from Gairloch. The start of the distilling story, of course, goes back into the mists of time, though the first reference I have to whisky in Scotland is in the Scottish Exchequer Rolls of 1494. Production then was very much described as a back kitchen affair made for domestic consumption, a savage dram, from malted barley in crude pot stills. 1751, one of the Seafield papers records, the long use of spiritual liquors has been the long use of spirituous liquors has been reckoned cherishing and in some degree necessary. Perhaps in regard to the latter, one might think of the men who had to repair the main pier of the Bridge of Spey during the winter of 1768, or the men who floated timber down the river to Garmouth, fortified by frequent large measures of whisky. As duty was imposed on whisky, the successive increased illicit distillation and the avoidance of duty became a matter of routine, if not of principle. The Sma still was on display in the Courthouse Museum and came from Achindoon, where it had produced high-quality spirit for many years, and there are many stories of illicit distillation and smuggling. One such was told by Alex Cumming in his book on the Braes. About 1800, there were at least 3 Sma stills in full working order in the Braes. It was necessary, of course, to keep a keen lookout for the gauger, and on his appearance at Glascoyle or at Garth Keen, a prearranged signal, usually a sheet hung out, was given to warn the Braes folk of his proximity. On one occasion, 2 gaugers avoided the vigilance of the watchers and appeared at a most inappropriate moment at a house in the Braes. Detection and capture seemed imminent, for there was much incriminating evidence in sight, but a quick-witted youth saved the situation. Flinging an empty keg on his shoulder, he dashed out just as the gaugers were approaching the door. Only when he had led them a safe distance from the house did he allow his pursuers to capture himself and the precious keg. And naturally, on returning to the house, nothing in the slightest degree suspicious was to be seen. The story of the legalization of the trade in this area comes from Balmenach, to where in the early years of the 19th century, James MacGregor had moved from Tomintoul. The story is related by Sir Robert Bruce Lockhart. Beside the arduous task of creating this farm, MacGregor continued the more profitable sideline of illicit distilling. Soon after the passing of the Act in 1823, he received a visit from the nearest excise officer. Their talk was friendly and began with a generous dram of pure malt whisky. When these preliminaries were finished to the satisfaction of both men, the excise officer mentioned shyly that he had his duty to perform and had better have a look around. Out went the two men to inspect the farm, and all went well until they came to a rough stone building with a mill wheel and a mill lathe by its side. "Oh, what'll that be?" asks the excise officer. "Oh, that'll just be the peat shed," was the reply. Nothing more was said, and the two men went back to the house for another dram and a talk about the crops and the prospects of the harvest. Then, as the gauger took his leave, he said quietly, "If I were you, Mr. MacGregor, I'd take out a licence for yon peat shed." And so started one of the earliest licensed distilleries in the Highlands, an honour shared with George Smith of Glenlivet, the owner of Mortlach, and Mrs. Gordon of Ballintom. And it wouldn't make sense to talk about brewing and distilling without taking a walk beyond the borough boundary and visiting the site of the new Gordon and MacPhail distillery at Lower Gaich. I'm afraid you'll have to travel 10, 12 years into the future to have a dram there of the new Cairn whisky. 3 years is the legal minimum for whisky. Despite being in Strathspey, a geographic description, which is very important for Grantown, which is after all the capital of Strathspey, the new drink will no doubt be marketed as Speyside whisky. Not far from the Cairn site is that of Ballintom Distillery, which was situated at Old Ballintom on the western snout of the ridge, and where rest the ancient standing stones. The distillery, first mentioned in 1824 with the application for a licence by Mrs. Gordon, had been in production for several years before Donald Gordon Ballintom wrote on the 15th of November 1851 to the factor of Strathspey about the Ballintom distillery. And there was noted a proposal 2 years later that Mrs. Gordon of Ballintom of taking the distillery across Dochernach. Although apparently perceived as a good idea, there's no evidence that this ever took place. Mrs. Anne Gordon was a relative of Captain John Grant of Congash, the factor. The distillery is mentioned in several directories through the 1860s, but on the OS map of 1868, it's marked as an empty building, which may indicate that by this time it had ceased business. This area of Strathspey is one of the most important historic sites in the whole of the valley of the Spey. It was the gathering point for the Clan Grant, and here on Tomlachroich in the 17th century was a gallows. Here, under the watchful eye of the Laird of Ludwig Grant, 8th of Fruchy, that Alan Cameron for near Gaich was hanged for murder, unbeknown to his mother who was spinning flax not far away. Sir Ludwig, impatient of the convict's last requests, allegedly demanded, between mouthfuls of the lunch he was eating, "Knock him off, he's confessed enough." The story of the search for justice for the murdered man was long and complicated before he was finally tracked down in an army mess in Ireland. It all started, however, with a quarrel in an inn not far from Ballyward. And our final stop is at that very inn at Inverallen. And not far from Inverallen churchyard was Inverallen House, built for the factor and close to the one-time site of Figget Fair. Of the inn, now nothing remains but its legend and the stories such as this, who wrote that the shrine of the saint had reached the last stage of sanctity and become transformed into an alehouse. And with that final irreverent comment, I take my leave. I hope you've had a pleasant journey and enjoyed a pleasant drink or two on the way. And there I end my round trip, apart from one small task remaining. Thank you.